So far, we've discussed wave after wave of the gang's criminal escapades, becoming infamous in 2 states and having been contracted by the heights of the DC criminal network to carry out their sordid business, all the while spreading Payday's influence and growing its wealth. This success didn't come without sacrifice, however. In the process, if you remember, we lost a crew member and a friend. Hoxton now resided in high security prison, likely for life. Today, we're going to discuss the lifeline he was handed and the shady figure who extended this olive branch as we work towards reinstating James Hoxworth. This is the story of Payday. Meet the dentist, the calm, calculating and ambitious criminal contractor. Oh, and practicing dental specialist. His jobs were all of the highest scale and risk. Bain may have been a logistic and well-connected genius, but his expertise paled in comparison to the meticulous way the dentist would plan, blueprint and research a job. The dentist profession was exuded in how he'd conduct business. His obsession with fine detail and carefully chosen turn of speech made him an enigmatic figure that one could not possibly ignore. The dentist appeared to also be a man with untold years of experience under his belt. Beyond just this, his speech patterns seemed researched and almost calculated, like someone with all the time in the world. You could even say he was a physical manifestation of all we fear in dentists. Even the unusual circumstances under which Dallas was introduced to this figure were no accident. Attending a regular dental checkup, Dallas assumed his Nathan Steele alias. In truth, it actually appears like many amongst us, Dallas is not all that comfortable when on the receiving end of dental work. So when he sees his regular trusted dentist as being deputized by another, we witness just how uncomfortable this makes him. Rightly so, it seems, as this man is more than simply a dental professional. After sitting Dallas down for his checkup, this becomes abundantly clear, recounting knowledge of events few should know outside of the gang themselves. I think the way the dentist goes about this shows just how informed and calculating the man truly was, taking his role in dentistry and leveraging it as a position of physical power. You see, no man's going to be unwilling to listen whilst to drill words in their mouth. Even Dallas, a calculating criminal himself, would sit and take it all in. And take it all in he does, until he's free from the chair and in a position to refuse. Yet the dentist had one more ace up his sleeve if his offers of daring heists and immense riches didn't suffice. He claims to have the resources to free Hoxton, going far beyond what McKendrick offered of relocating him, promising that he could use his ties and influence to get our man a retrial. Although there was no legal maneuver out there that could free old Hox, so immense was the wall of evidence against him, the dentist knew that the more he was moved, and the further away from prison he was taken, the easier it would be to break him out by force. Now this was an offer Dallas could not ignore. So, planning began on the dentist's first heist, the Benevolent Bank, set to lay the groundwork for the breakout. But before we go any further, just who was the dentist? He's a man with very little history known about him. We learn later, after accessing the FBI files, that the first recorded mention of him was in the dying breath of a James Napalm Westmore, when his gang hit the Benevolent Bank in 1977. Of course, a failed attempt at the supposed unbreakable stronghold that the dentist had lined up for the Payday gang to take on. Westmore's dying words are quoted as, "Tell the dentist to go back to hell." Ominous, if that's where he came from. More frightening though, is that this is a man whose plans and schemes had ended other experienced criminals' lives. What's even stranger is that this was almost 40 years ago at the time we were introduced to him. For just how long had this guy been operating, and how old did that really make him? When Dallas first meets him, he looks a man in his 50s, so is the dentist just an alias that gets passed down? And why is he so obsessed with these locations in particular, trying to hit the Benevolent Bank in the past? All of these questions probably filled Bain's mind, but his promise to aid in freeing James Hoxworth was all that filled Dallas's. Good sense and judgment really went out the window, and all other plans and contracts were put on the back burner. This was a job fueled by emotion, but first, we had to give the dentist his payday. Big Bank was the first step in doing exactly that, seeing us right his failure in 1977 and finally enter the vault of the unrobbable bank, the Benevolent. The dentist's seemingly endless list of connections changed how the crew would approach heists from now on, using these inside men to disrupt the vast security operations, time locks, and vault mechanisms the Benevolent housed. The crew utilized their largest anti-vault tool yet, the Beast, a drill so enormous that it required multi-part assembly. Bane chose to audaciously mock the force even further by hiding this tool in a massive ceramic piggy bank hanging from an industrial crane. Floyd, as he was dubbed, proved that pigs can indeed fly, and so too can their helmets. Proceeding through the time lock to the vault, the gang drilled through to the most vast store of cash and bullion they'd seen since Overdrill. Escaping with their prize, though, was another thing altogether. Dragging it all through the massive ornate halls of the Benevolent carried a death wish. Fortunately, an aerial rooftop escape was absolutely on the cards. Bile met the gang on the vast roof of the bank, holding down the more defensible high ground position to load up the chopper. The four escaped, but not before awarding the civilian who'd been of surprising assistance during the assault. I wonder what became of him. And so, the start of a partnership, seemingly profitable to both partners, as over 200 years of historical security was thwarted in one fell swoop. The stakes and ambition of the Payday gang was finally starting to rival the scale of their New York spree, seemingly elevated by this dentist character. The Benevolent hit may well have been a statement, but in hindsight it was little more than just the first test. Soon after, the dentist saw it fit to test the crew once again, as well as open the door to Hoxton's retrial. Codename Hotline Miami would see us tie up one loose end for the dentist while enabling him to leverage his connections and force through the retrial. The objective was the assassination of a man known as the Commissar, an infamous Russian mob boss named Grigory Beria. You see, Beria had ties to the district attorney. Once he was out the way, the dentist would be free to apply the full force of his political leverage upon the DA, securing the staged retrial and, given the clearly corrupt nature of the attorney, even reducing the security surrounding Hoxton's prison escort. Again, we're able to use favours with the dentist to more accurately place assets to assist in the heist, suggesting he was more connected and certainly more omnipotent than even Bane. A scary thought, but one the gang could leverage to their advantage. Day one of this heist is spent terrorising and goading the Commissar into opening a line of communication with the gang. This in turn would allow Bane to track down the location of his mob's operations. The crew slaughtered his men, set fire to his cars, and destroyed a gas station on his payroll. The Commissar's threats and a vain attempt to cease the destruction of his property and assets were his undoing, allowing the Payday gang to gather his precise location from a delivery barcode to the address which Bane had traced to a wider area from his radio contacts. Day 2 sees the gang make full use of this information, storming his sordid apartment complex, which was the epicenter of the Commissar's criminal undertakings and debauchery. This was more of the loud and heavy approach we'd seen from the Payday gang of old, tailing the Commissar to the roof of the complex, discovering his stash of valuable cocaine and a vault representing the Commissar's last roll of the dice. Sadly for him, he was unaware that the Payday gang, thermal drills, and vaults have somewhat of a symbiotic relationship by this point. Bile delivers, and the gang commence the drilling. If you wanted some indication of the Commissar's wealth and power, the gunship he employed to force the crew away from the vault door should offer you some indication. It was all for naught though, with Dallas and company cracking yet another vault and laying waste to the Commissar. Suspiciously, the dentist didn't seem to have any interest in the dividends of regular loot, such as the Commissar's coke, a big boost to the gang's bottom line, but further muddying understanding of his motivations. If not in it for wealth, then what? Well, the crew wouldn't have to wait long to find out, but first, it was time for him to uphold his end of the bargain. During the wait for Hoxton's retrial date, the Payday gang were ordered to go quiet. Specifically, Chains chose to head to his personal safe house located in Sweden. Here, he was tracked down by the Swedish Special Forces. Alone, he faced an unknown number of armed officers, and for a moment, it looked like a second Payday gang rescue may have been in order. Except, the Swedish police were not the only ones on Chains' tail. He was also followed by an old friend, John Wick. Yes, the very same Wick you may have heard of, the Boogeyman, a famed hitman amongst the right or wrong circles depending on how you look at it. Wick, the only member of the crew to not bother with an alias. Seeing as he already lived his life as a hitman, he was afforded the sort of legal protection that an alias didn't cover. A personal tragedy had brought him back into this lifestyle, and revenge against his former boss, Viggo Tarasov, had left him intrinsically entangled in the world of violence he'd once escaped from. Desperate for a reprieve from senseless murder, he took the initiative, contacting the Payday crew to fight for a cause and a fortune. His connection to Chains appeared to be a military one, both serving in the US Marine Corps. Using his skills as a hitman, Wick covered Chains' escape from the idyllic lakeside house, overwatching from an unknown sniper position. In return for helping out his old friend, Wick's only request was a ticket to join the Payday gang, appreciating the nobility of their cause. Chains, being especially grateful, was more than willing to vouch for Wick, emphasizing his trustworthiness and marksmanship, but the crew as a whole was skeptical. Already, with the intention to reinstate old Hoxton, they were looking at a crew of 5, more than they'd ever operated with before. Wouldn't adding more members simply increase their overall risk? After much deliberation, accounting for the fact that Wick was known also to Hoxton, his place was sealed within the gang. He wouldn't join up immediately, instead heading for DC after his own loose ends were tied up. But from this moment on, Payday began to represent more of a syndicate of exceptionally talented heisters, as opposed to just a small unit, for better or for worse. Now, onto the gang's crowning glory, that cemented their image of inevitability within the DC forces. The DA had crumbled under the dentist's pressure, and Hoxton's transfer to the retrial location was easily secured. The gang employed an inside man to pass on the Breakout plan to their old ally, intending to intercept his armed detail in the prisoner transfer tunnels, which ran beneath the courtroom that was to preside over his parole hearing. The time window here was obviously tight. Wolf drilled a banknote through the wall, indicating to Hoxton to get down, grabbing for the note to distract his captors and avoid the brunt of the control blast. But his understudy, New Hoxton, was slightly off in his timing and measurement of the C4, delaying the blast and hitting Hoxton in the leg with a piece of stray debris from the explosion. Despite this mishap, after blasting through the thick concrete walls, the gang swiftly dealt with his armed escort and moved to carry the plan into its second stage. It's here, though, the crew sees a new, more bitter side to Hoxton, as well as his now scarred face. This scarring, we would later learn, was the result of a chemical bleach burn inflicted by a fellow prisoner. It seems that this, alongside the clear resentment he'd been harbouring over his arrest and rapid replacement, had taken its toll on his psyche. Probably not helped by the metal piping lodged in his thigh, Hoxton was clearly more cynical, sarcastic, and was aiming much of that venom at Dallas's little brother, the man who'd stolen his face, reputation, and name. It's at this point Hoxton coins New Hoxton's, or as he saw him, the imposter's, new name, Houston. While originally a derogatory dig emphasizing that he had a problem now Hoxton was back in the crew, over time the name grew to have its own reputation, being another Texan location and following the naming convention of his brother's alias. The name would become just as feared as Hoxton's, probably to his extreme displeasure. At least now, I can talk about the two without it being incredibly confusing. Following his outburst at Houston, and once Dallas had seen to his wound, the second phase began, a planned high-speed escape to a short-term safe house in a fortified armoured truck. Despite Hoxton's escort being lightly armed at the behest of the dentist, the infamy of the gang and its well-known affiliation with Hoxworth had brought quite the police presence to the streets of DC, wary of the gang's scheming. Rightly so, except Hoxton was one step ahead. The police presence be damned, why waste the time now his freedom was secured? He was certain there was a rat within crime.net, someone who had delivered the feds to his doorstep and provided the evidence needed to secure his conviction. So, to the FBI headquarters they would go, navigating a nearby multi-story car park to shake the police pursuit. On the way there, Hoxton revealed his new mask, allowing Houston to keep his old face, one he no longer identified with after his scarring and change of demeanour left him more vicious than before. Unsurprisingly, the FBI headquarters, situated at the Hoover Building, were on high alert after the escape, making a quiet entrance impossible. However, because of the breakout, they'd sent their usually garrisoned forces as first responders, leaving home unguarded. This meant a Payday gang which was not only reinforced by Hoxton's presence, but also armed for virtual war, made short work of the station troops, breaking into the force's command center and hacking their main server, as Hoxton sought information on the individual who he believed had sold the entire gang out, potentially also explaining the troubles Chains had back in Sweden. Whilst analysing the data loaded on the server, Hox was unable to find anything concrete like a name, but he did find plenty of evidence to corroborate his insider man theory, as well as information that would inevitably lead the gang to this rat if they could use Bane and the dentist's considerable resources to decrypt the server information. As such, stealing the FBI's main server was the new objective, one that they completed with ease. These newly downloaded encryption keys, specific case files, and secured DNA samples made this server Crime.net's greatest treasure, a true trove of confidential information regarding the clown case, putting the Payday gang 2 steps ahead of their police pursuers at all times. It was probably this audacious waltz into the federal property which was the straw that broke the camel's back as far as the DC force was concerned, as soon after, big changes started to be implemented. In the wake of the hit on the headquarters, Wick joined up with the crew proper, although despite the crew growing in number, jobs remained a 4-person ordeal, as any more would muddy operations and make a subtle approach much harder. Hoxton and Hoxton were often separated whenever possible. With Hox back in the crew, you may be surprised to hear that he never really reprised his role as a marksman. Instead, we see he'd become much more of a hardened scrapper and dirty fighter owing to his experiences in prison. Although hell-bent on revenge, decoding the server information was no small operation, so his bloodlust had to be contained. Lest we forget, before revenge could come, we had to repay the man who'd enabled any of this. The dentist needed his diamond. He'd been waiting long enough.